Welcome to our channel. Hey guys, tonight we're diving into a story stranger than your uncle's Facebook posts at 3 a.m., the forgotten Spanish morphine epidemic of the early 1900s. You know, the era when hats were tall, mustaches were suspicious, and Spain was quietly becoming the world capital of oops. My doctor gave me morphine for a sore throat, and now I'm dreaming of jazz. So before you settle in, take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. Leave a comment telling me where you are listening from and what time it is for you now. Dim the lights, switch on a fan for that white noise, and get as comfortable as possible. Let's get curious for a second. Have you ever wondered what would it feel like to walk the streets of Madrid with a pocket full of morphine ampoules and a doctor's note saying, "Take as needed," especially during awkward social situations? Did Spanish pharmacies really hand out opiates like mints? What was the etiquette for morphine at family dinners? Could you accidentally become a local celebrity for snoring too loud in a cafe? And, most importantly, how did Spain go from a land of flamenco and garlic to a nation where everyone's grand seemed a little too relaxed about their medication schedule? Congratulations, you've just woken up. In 1905, Spain. The air smells faintly of strong coffee, stronger opinions, and just a hint of medicinal misadventure. Good luck, Spain, in the early 1900s, where pharmacies outnumbered bakeries, and if you sneezed, a helpful stranger would hand you morphine, just in case. Picture streets lined with elegant shops, each window glittering with glass bottles, promising relief from well-being alive. Let's set the scene. You step out onto a Madrid boulevard, cobblestones underfoot, the scent of roasting chestnuts in the air, and more green crosses blinking above shop doors than you'd see outside an airport in Amsterdam today. Formalins stand shoulder to shoulder, all gold-lettered windows and polished wood counters. Step inside, and you're greeted not by a bored teenager with a barcode scanner, but a pharmacist in a stiff collar, ready to serve you up a solution. For every possible ailment, real or imagined: toothache, morphine syrup, a touch of melancholy tincture of opium with a hint of cherry for the kids. Back then, a Spanish pharmacy wasn't just a place to fill a prescription. It was the nerve center of the neighborhood, the original social network. Need advice on your back pain? The pharmacist would listen with the gravity of a priest and the curiosity of a local gossip, and after your diagnosis he'd reach for a tiny glass vial. No child-proof caps, no warning labels, just pure, undiluted optimism. And by optimism I mean morphine. The choices were dizzying: rows of brown and blue bottles all lined up like a Victorian chemistry set, each promising a different flavor of oblivion. Elixir device boasted it would cure everything but taxes. Tonic Curios was basically a liquid nap for the anxious. There were even morphine-laced lozenges, perfect for soothing your throat and knocking you out just long enough to forget why you went to the pharmacy in the first place. If Amazon had existed, same-day delivery would have included a pharmacist and a fainting couch. It's hard to overstate how common this was. By 1907, pharmacies were springing up on every corner in every city. In some neighborhoods you could stand at the door of one and throw a stone into the window of another, not that you'd want to. Glass was expensive, and you'd probably pull a muscle, but still the density was impressive. Even small villages could support 2 or 3, each locked in fierce competition to see who could come up with the most sleep-inducing tonic. Forget Yelp reviews. Word of mouth was king, and every grandma in Spain had an opinion. And the atmosphere inside? A gentle clatter of mortars and pestles, the heady aroma of menthol, violets, and, yes, a subtle whiff of morphine powder floating above the shelves. If you were lucky, the pharmacist might even let you sniff the newest imported remedies right there. No questions asked, no awkward paperwork. Ever tried to get a prescription refilled by showing your pharmacist a poem about aching bones and silent suffering? In 1905, Spain, you'd probably get a double dose plus a free sample for the road. Let's talk about etiquette. Buying medicine was a public affair. No shame, no secrecy, just a parade of neighbors all in search of a cure for something. Cough, toothache, heartbreak, existential dread brought on by late-stage Spanish Empire. No problem, the pharmacist has something for that, and he'll even wrap it up with a ribbon, if you ask nicely. People gossiped, flirted, confessed their worries and sometimes forgot what they came in for after a single sniff of the latest tincture. Why did doctors prescribe morphine for coughs, colds, melancholy, marital disappointment and existential dread? Because in 1905, morphine wasn't just for pain. It was for breakfast, lunch, dinner and those awkward moments when your neighbor tried to sell you a goat. Let's back up in an era before antibiotics, before effective mental health treatment, before most people even trusted the idea of a germ. Spain's greatest medical minds had discovered one universal truth: if you can't fix a problem, you can at least make everyone too sleepy to notice. And so morphine swept across the nation, slipping quietly into doctors' bags and family medicine cabinets everywhere. No matter the symptom, morphine was the answer. Toothache morphine, cough morphine. Your cousin Pepe lost another chicken morphine, though not for the chicken, sadly. If you found yourself feeling a little blue, maybe the economy had crashed, maybe your hat was out of fashion, maybe you just remembered how long the wait is at the post office, your friendly physician could be counted on to pull out a small bottle of remedy milligrams. Take a spoonful before bed, he'd say, and another if you wake up feeling philosophical. The secret ingredient: enough morphine to make even your dreams need a nap. Doctors, bless them, were true believers. They prescribed morphine for almost anything you could name, and several things you probably couldn't: nervousness before a wedding, a morphine injection for the bride, a morphine lozenge for the groom and a morphine vapor rub for the in-laws. Just in case feeling tired after a long train ride, a tiny ampoule straight from the chemist's mysterious black bag. It was, as one 1906 magazine declared, the modern solution for the ancient problem of existence. Side effects included drowsiness, contentment and an unusual tolerance for your neighbors. Accordion practice. Pharmaceutical companies were thrilled at last: a product for every ailment, every age group, every possible complaint. They churned out morphine pills, morphine cough syrups, morphine invigorating tonics and even morphine chewing gum. You could take your medicine by mouth, by injection, or, for the truly fashionable, in little dissolving lozenges that came in tins decorated with flowers and cheerful warnings. For relief of cough pain and general malaise. If you weren't already unwell, you might be tempted to try it anyway. Just for the pretty packaging, mothers swore by. Morphine drops for teething babies keeps the house quiet for hours. One advertisement promised, right above a drawing of a smiling sleeping infant and a mother finally getting to read her favorite cereal in the newspaper. No one seemed too worried about the long-term effects if the baby grew up a little more relaxed than expected. Well, there were worse things besides. There was always more morphine, if anyone got anxious about it. Of course, morphine wasn't just for the home. Schools kept a bottle in the nurse's cabinet for overexcitement. Factories handed out tablets to workers suffering from muscular discomfort or repetitive disappointment. Even priests and monks kept a supply on hand, just in case the congregation got too lively during Mass. For a few golden years, Spain was the land of the universally soothed. And yet with so much miracle cure floating around, daily life took on a surreal edge. People walked a little slower. Long lines at the bakery no longer resulted in arguments. Everyone was too mellow to complain. The city trams moved at a snail's pace, but no one seemed to mind. In cafes, conversations drifted and slowed until whole groups of people sat contentedly in silence, staring at nothing in particular, thinking gentle, morphine-flavored thoughts. Neighborhood dogs, sensing the change, started taking longer naps. Even the pigeons waddled with unusual tranquility. It started innocently: science, hope and a little too much trust in German pharmaceutical brochures. Soon enough, magic wasn't just a flame step. It was a tiny glass ampoule with a big promise and a bigger hangover. To understand how Spain fell head over heels for injectable morphine, you first have to picture the times. The late 19th and early 20th centuries were heady days for European medicine. Across the continent, scientists were inventing things left and right: telegraphs, zeppelins and, most importantly for our story, the hypodermic syringe. Suddenly, you didn't have to drink bitter tonics or gnaw on willow bark to feel better. You could simply visit your local doctor and zap, receive a little shot of instant relief. Spanish doctors always ready to be at the cutting edge. And who could blame them? Medical conferences in Paris included free wine, quickly adopted the new injectable therapies. The hypodermic syringe arrived in Madrid around the 1860s and within a few decades was as common as a handkerchief at a bullfight. Doctors carried their syringes in elegant, velvet-lined cases that wouldn't look out of place at a magician's table. Some even practiced dramatic flourishes when removing them, because if you're going to inject your patient with land sienna, you might as well do it with style. But where did the magic shoot get its mystique? Enter the German pharmaceutical companies, who had perfected the art of marketing almost as well as they'd perfected morphine itself. Their catalogs full of hand-tinted illustrations of sturdy nurses, glowing children and grateful grandmothers promised Spanish physicians that injectable morphine was rapid, reliable and rejuvenating. If you believed the ads, you'd think the only thing morphine couldn't do was find you a better job. Soon the word was out. If you wanted to be modern, if you wanted to be somebody, you got the shot. No more outdated folk remedies, no more foul-tasting herbal teas from your neighbor's cousin who claimed to be a healer. Just a clean little jab and a blissful wave of euphoria. Doctors themselves got caught up in the excitement, prescribing injections for everything from backache to heartbreak if your patient seemed a little anxious, a little restless, a little too talkative about politics. Morphine, if they weren't, well, maybe a preventative dose. The effect was electric. Middle-class Spaniards lined up for injections the way modern folks line up for iPhones. Getting a shot was not just about health, it was a status symbol. Did you hear? Don Rafael gets the injunction Malika twice a week. His wife's piano recital are half as long as before. People swapped stories about their doctors, the way we compare Wi-Fi speeds. Everyone wanted the fastest, the newest, the most pain-free experience available. Of course, this wasn't always about actual pain. For some, the magic shot became an all-purpose solution to boredom, melancholy, or the spiritual exhaustion of living through the Industrial Revolution in a suit that never quite fit right. Housewives whispered to each other over the laundry lines, "Just ask for the little glass ampoule, the one with the German label." Even school teachers and priests weren't immune, though the latter preferred to call it a restorative for contemplation. Pharmacies kept their best ampoules behind the counter, wrapped in tissue and twine, like tiny, expensive gifts. Some families even kept a special cabinet for their supplies, next to the cherry and the family silver. There was a ritual to it, the tapping of the glass, the flicking of the syringe, the gentle squeeze of the plunger. It was clinical, yes, but also a little theatrical, a daily performance of progress, with morphine as the star. Spanish medicine in the 1900s was hands-on, really hands-on. Feeling a bit tired, morphine bit too awake. Morphine stubbed your toe on a cobblestone, morphine twice, for good measure. Why talk about your problems when you can nap through them? Let's talk about the house call, once a charming ritual, now a relic lost to time. Back then, the neighborhood doctor was part healer, part family friend, part traveling magician. There was no WebMD, no online appointment and definitely no, "Please hold for the next available nurse." Instead, you sent your youngest child running down the block with a note scribbled in pencil, "Dear doctor, I have developed a mysterious pain in my left arm. And, more concerningly, in my soul." Within the hour, the doctor would appear, top hat, slightly askew, carrying a black leather bag stuffed with daisies worth of glass vials, powders and a syringe so shiny it doubled as a mirror. In 1905, Spain, a physician's greatest tool was not his stethoscope but his ability to prepare an injection with a single practiced flick of the wrist. He'd listen to your complaints, nod gravely and reach straight for the morphine ampoule. No paperwork, no warnings, just a firm belief that a little opiate could smooth out life's many, many wrinkles. Symptoms: any symptom. Complaints ranged from headaches, insomnia, heartbreak, joint pain, muscle soreness, existential gloom. My neighbor's dog is too loud, and I have no appetite for boiled cabbage. The solution: one syringe fits all. There was a certain egalitarianism about it. Morphine didn't care if you were rich or poor, noble or peasant. You got the shot, and if you didn't feel better, the doctor would give you a little more. Until you did, or at least until you forgot what you were worried about in the first place. The bedside manner was legendary. Spanish doctors of the age, mixed science, charm and the faint scent of hair oil. They didn't just treat the illness, they treated the entire family. After a round of injections, mothers would sigh in relief, fathers would doze in armchairs, and even the family cat might look suspiciously drowsy. Sometimes the doctor stayed for lunch enjoying a bowl of gazpacho while keeping an eye out for any family member who looked tense or suspiciously awake. And then there were the nervous complaints, a catch-all term for anything involving sadness, irritability, anxiety, or the general sensation of being alive. No one really knew what the nerves were, but everyone agreed they were best handled with a quick jab of morphine. Teenagers struggling with exams. Morphine. Middle-aged men overwhelmed by the pressures of modern hat-wearing morphine. Grandmothers mourning the loss of the family. Donkey double morphine with a cup of tea and a slice of orange for color. Doctors' notebooks from the time read like surreal shopping lists. March 3, visited Señorita Gomez. Complaint: cannot sleep. Treatment: morphine injection. March 4, Señor Cordero. Pain in knees and regrets about past choices. Treatment: morphine injection. March 5. Baby just, teething and general malaise. Treatment: a few drops of morphine syrup. And so it went, a daily parade of aches, soothed, hearts calmed and reality blurred, one syringe at a time. No visit was too trivial. If you had a cough that lasted longer than a day, the doctor was there, ample at the ready. If you were a child with a scraped knee, the doctor might prescribe a soothing ligament for the wound and morphine for your mother's nerves. If your uncle's mustache drooped unusually low, it was probably a sign of underlying melancholy. Only one solution: roll up your sleeve. Suddenly, mothers across Spain were feeling just wonderful. The secret nervous exhaustion cured by a little shot in the arm before making paella. Kids noticed dinner got a lot quieter and sometimes included dessert for breakfast. The Spanish home of 1907 was changing. For centuries, the archetype of the Spanish mother was a woman in perpetual motion, cooking, cleaning, scrubbing, organizing, mediating family drama and occasionally wielding a sandal with terrifying accuracy. But as the pharmacy boom brought new solutions to every doorstep, the middle-class mom discovered something that could quiet her worries and give her a tiny oasis of peace in a chaotic house: morphine. It started innocently enough. Women went to the pharmacist for the usual complaints: fatigue, women's troubles, headaches, the classic, "I am tired of everyone in this house." And the pharmacist, always attentive, would nod gravely, reach behind the counter and offer a small bottle or perhaps a dainty vial labeled with the reassuring words for nervous conditions. A teaspoon here, a dropper full there, and suddenly life's sharp edges softened. The laundry pile looked smaller, the neighbor's gossip faded into a gentle hum. For the first time many mothers felt they could truly relax, even if only for a little while. Society, of course, was entirely on board. Newspaper ads praised morphine as the modern, scientific solution for overworked housewives. Restore serenity, they promised, next to illustrations of glowing women in starched aprons smiling eco-typically at their spotless kitchens. Magazines published testimonials. Ever since I started my daily tonic, I hardly notice the clatter of the children, and my husband's snoring no longer keeps me awake. I even enjoy ironing. The family doctor, eager to keep up with the times, would happily sign off on a prescription for tired nerves, often without asking what else might be going on. And so a new kind of motherhood blossomed, a motherhood that was calm, unflappable, and just a bit more horizontal than before. Gone were the days of stern lectures and raised eyebrows. Instead, dinner time became a peaceful affair, with mothers floating serenely through the kitchen, gently stirring stews and humming lists that seemed to last an hour or two longer than necessary. Children sensing a change pushed boundaries. Could they have extra bread? Of course, sweetie. Could they trade chores for marbles? Why not? It was as if the entire notion of discipline had been replaced with a blissful fog. Of course, the ripple effects were everywhere. Friends gathered over coffee and pastries, quietly comparing notes. "My nerves used to be a disaster," confessed Senora Ruiz, "but now I just smile." Book clubs devolved into group naps. School events saw an unusual number of mothers snoozing contentedly through student recital. Even neighborhood feuds, a sacred Spanish tradition, became rare as both parties forgot what they were arguing about and decided to settle things with a slice of cake. For many it felt like a revolution. Mothers who had never taken a moment for themselves suddenly embraced self-care, even if that care involved a mysterious amber liquid from the back of the pantry. They took more walks, spent more time in the garden, and smiled benevolently at children's shenanigans that would once have caused an inquisition. Husbands, meanwhile, were baffled by their wives' newfound tranquility, unsure whether to celebrate or be suspicious, but as long as the laundry got done and the plan came outright, most chose not to ask questions. Forget tappers, bars. Pharmacies became the place to see and be seen. Need advice? Get a lozenge and a friendly chat. Need to forget that advice? There's a powder for that. The local pharmacist knew more about your secrets than your priest. Step inside a Spanish pharmacy in 1906. And you weren't just stepping into a drugstore, you were entering a full-blown community hub. Imagine a cross between a coffee shop, a therapist's office, and your nosiest neighbor's living room, only with more jars and slightly better lighting. Shelves line the walls like a library of promises: elixir for calm, powders for digestion, syrups for sorrow, and pills for the peculiar aches of modern life. There was a ritual to it. You entered, nodded at the elderly man already dozing in the corner chair, removed your hat, if you had one, and you did, and greeted the pharmacist like a long-lost cousin, Senor Martin. You'd say, "My joints are stiff, my sleep is broken, and my wife is humming again." He'd nod sympathetically, reach under the counter and produce a small brown bottle with the kind of quiet reverence usually reserved for holy relics. But you weren't alone. While you waited, you mingled. The pharmacy was rarely empty. There was always someone there, women in shawls discussing their husbands, snoring grandfathers recounting their latest mysterious ailments, teenagers trying to look casual as they requested that tonic for energy while avoiding eye contact. And everyone, asking for something for the nerves, which was 1900s code, for I live in a loud house, and I'd like to feel nothing for an hour. The pharmacist, meanwhile, floated among them like a benevolent alchemist, nodding solemnly and scribbling on scraps of paper, each scribble worth its weight in morphine. You didn't need a diagnosis, you needed a story. If you explained your symptoms with enough flair, gestures helped, you might even get the stronger version. And if you were particularly dramatic, there was always the special glass ampoule, the kind you didn't talk about too loudly because technically it was for emergencies, and everyone in the room knew that emergency meant my cousin is visiting for the weekend. Some customers came in daily, not because they were sick, but because the pharmacy had become their favorite place. It was warm in the winter, cool in the summer, and always stocked with mild euphoria and light gossip. The pharmacist knew everyone's business: who was courting whom, who was secretly borrowing money, who might be expecting a child or a lawsuit. He heard everything, and he said nothing unless you asked him directly, in which case he'd cough quietly and say, "I couldn't possibly comment," while handing you a small tin of morphine lines, that said for persistent coughs. You couldn't rush it. Visits to the pharmacy took time. People lingered. They'd comment on your posture, your color, your walking speed. If you looked too cheerful, someone would insist you were hiding something and recommend a balancing tonic. If you looked tired, someone else would pat your hand and whisper, "Try the blue bottle." Worked wonders for my sister's chicken. And then there were the waiting benches, hard, uncomfortable, always occupied. You'd sit between a man who hadn't sneezed in 3 weeks and a woman who was certain she had moon fever, and together you'd discuss the weather, the price of beans, and whether the new pharmacist's apprentice looked like he knew what he was doing. He didn't, but he wore a lab coat and that was good enough. No one really knew how much was too much. Some doctors gave out enough morphine to calm a bull, others measured with the precision of a man throwing rice at a wedding. The result, a nation just slightly sideways at the heart of the problem, was this: dosing was more of an art than a science, and by art we mean fingerprinting, blindfolded while someone reads you Latin. In early 1900s, Spain, the average physician was working with vague guidelines, handwritten notes and a deeply unearned confidence in their personal judgment. The phrase, "start low, go slow," had not yet entered the medical lexicon. Instead, it was more like, start wherever you like, and hope your patient wakes up by Thursday. Imagine walking into your doctor's office complaining of tooth pain. He frowns thoughtfully, pulls out a glass vial of morphine, taps it like he's checking its mood and gives you a dose based on your general vibe. Were you tall? Extra morphine seemed nervous, morphine, quiet and polite, a double dose. Clearly you're repressing something, and it wasn't just about the patient. Some doctors prided themselves on having a strong hand, which in practice meant they gave everyone the same dose, regardless of age, weight or the fact that you once fainted at the sight of an onion. Others had no scale or dropper and instead relied on a good sense of proportion, which is not what you want when dealing with a sedative powerful enough to tranquilize a disgruntled opera singer. To make things even more exciting, the strength of morphine varied wildly. One pharmacist might dilute it into a gentle syrup, another might hand you a vial so potent it needed its own confession. There were no universal standards, no warning labels and absolutely no chance your doctor would say the words, "This may cause drowsiness." If anything, drowsiness was the goal. The result, an entire generation of Spaniards walking the tightrope between blissful relief and unintentional hibernation. People would take their dose head off to do errands and suddenly find themselves sitting in a park 3 towns over, unsure whether it was Tuesday or still part of last week. Grandfathers fell asleep mid-tale. Children's birthday parties ended in group naps. At least one local official allegedly signed a treaty while under the influence of an experimental nerve tonic and later claimed he thought he was agreeing to a cheese delivery. Doctors, of course, did their best. They weren't out to harm anyone, they just trusted the medicine. They'd read glowing testimonials in medical journals, most of which had been written by the pharmaceutical companies themselves. One article confidently stated that morphine restores dignity to the disheartened. Another described it as appropriate for all ages and temperaments, which is a bold claim for a drug that turns your central nervous system into a puddle. If a patient returned saying the dose was too strong, the doctor might nod and reduce it slightly. If the patient didn't return at all, the doctor assumed they were cured or had moved to the countryside to live a simpler, sleepier life. Some doctors began to notice a pattern of patients growing increasingly groggy, but others chalked it up to the modern condition or a mysterious fog that just seemed to settle over people in the city. It wasn't denial, it was just mild confusion probably caused by morphine. Families started adjusting on their own. Mothers split doses between children. Neighbors swapped advice. Don't take the doctor's morning pills before walking near fountains, they'd whisper, you'll end up in the water asking pigeons for directions again. Even pets weren't entirely safe. One memorable incident involved a family giving their goat a small sample to calm it down before market. The goat fell asleep in the wagon and missed the entire transaction. Billboards and newspapers filled with ads for morphine toothpaste, morphine cough drops and even morphine tonic for children. The only thing not available, a warning label. Marketing departments were having the time of their lives, and so were their customers. The early 1900s in Spain was a golden age for medicine, an even golder one for marketing. It was a time when advertising wasn't about subtlety or fine print. It was about grandeur, flourish and wildly overstated claims, delivered in fonts so decorative they made your eyes twitch. Morphine wasn't just a medication, it was a lifestyle, and the people selling it were artists, overconfident, euphoric artists, with access to ink paper and absolutely no regulation. Open a newspaper in 1905, and you'd be bombarded with full-page ads featuring cherubic babies sleeping soundly under banners, reading Elixir de la Paz for the anxious child. Flip to the next page and there's a strong-jawed man gazing boldly into the distance while holding a glowing bottle for strength, clarity and digestive regularity. Try Dr. Alvaro's morphine formula. Below that, a dancing woman in a corset, twirling through a field of lies while holding a tin-labeled syrup of serenity. It was like a fever dream that just happened to be available at your local pharmacy. Posters plastered across brick walls, kiosks, and the backs of trams turned morphine into a kind of celebrity. You didn't just take it, you supported your favorite brand. Some ads leaned into the exotic, boasting about German precision in every drop. Others appealed to national pride, crafted in Barcelona, trusted by matadors, because nothing screams medical safety like a man in tights fighting a bull while lightly sedated. And oh, the taglines. Sleep like a saint. Bring back the sparkle to your eyes. Banquet tonight, nerves in a tangle. There's a syrup for that. Restore your natural harmony with just a hint of morphine. It was marketing poetry written by people who had almost certainly sampled the product. Even toothpaste wasn't safe. One particularly memorable ad showed a dazzling smile. Under the slogan, "Numb the gums, brighten the day," this brand proudly boasted trace opiates for a smoother morning routine, because nothing pairs with breakfast like a mild narcotic. And mint mouthwash followed suit, promising fresh breath and a gentle calm. It's unclear what gentle calm means in dental hygiene, but sales soared anyway. Children's products were a category all their own. Bottles featured pictures of sleepy toddlers with cheeks so rosy they looked sunburnt. Advertisements swore that Nana's night drops would eliminate tantrums, teething, bedwetting, nightmares and general childlike behavior in under 5 minutes. Mothers praised these tonics in testimonials that read like dreamy confessions. Ever since we started the syrup, little Louise no longer screams during thunderstorms. He mostly hums and we sleep better too. But perhaps the most breathtaking ads were the multi-core tonics. These concoctions claimed to solve dozens of ailments at once: migraines, melancholy, indigestion, heartbreak, bad dreams, weak ankles and even sensitivity to poetry, whatever that was. Some listed up to 30 benefits in tiny curling script that wrapped around the entire label. Side effects never mentioned, in fact. If you looked closely, most bottles didn't even specify dosage instructions, just vague suggestions like, take when needed or, for daily tranquility, sip responsibly, which was about as helpful as shouting advice into a hurricane. Pharmacists joined in decorating their shops with elaborate displays of glowing bottles under golden lighting. Seasonal promotions were common. Autumn featured Harvest Harmony syrup, while spring brought Audio Brill Nerve wine. Even churches got in on the fun, occasionally partnering with local apothecaries to promote godly restoratives. After long Lent services, you could leave confession with forgiveness and a calming herbal morphine infusion. In Spain, addiction wasn't just for alleyways and backrooms. It came with a hat, a cane, and the ability to recite poetry in Latin. Being high on morphine was almost a sign of sophistication, if you could stay awake long enough to appreciate it. Unlike today's gritty stereotypes of addiction, early 1900 Spain wrapped its morphine users in velvet. Literally, the more elegant the outfit, the more likely it concealed a monogrammed flask of something suspiciously medicinal. If you wore gloves, quoted Aristotle, and had a mysterious cough that required regular sipping, you were probably deep in the throes of socially acceptable sedation. The upper class embraced morphine, not as an escape, but as an accessory, a lifestyle enhancer, something you might enjoy between piano practice and judging your cousin's fiancé. They didn't abuse morphine, they curated it. Think of it like this: today, influencers post match lattes on marble countertops. In 1905, Madrid, they were comparing the color clarity of their morphine tinctures over midday, brandy and almond cakes. And it wasn't hidden. Oh no, these were not secretive users hiding behind curtains and shame. These were morally exhausted intellectuals and fragile artists who spoke openly about their delicate constitutions. It was in vogue to be emotionally complex, poetically unstable and heavily dosed. One duchess famously carried her morphine in a silver case engraved with the phrase "to calm the storm within." It was very moving, until someone pointed out she'd also accidentally drugged her dog with it. The dog, by all reports, took a long nap and came out calmer and more philosophical. Doctors reinforced the elegance of it all. They used words like melancholy, nervous strain and the feminine affliction upper ass. Women were often prescribed morphine for symptoms that sounded suspiciously like having a personality, headaches, sadness, being too clever. Reading novels. One woman was prescribed a 6-month morphine regimen after saying her piano teacher lacked depth. Men weren't left out either. The respectable morphine-using gentleman often sported a waistcoat with a built-in bottle pocket. It was normal, encouraged even, for such men to excuse themselves from dinner conversation to recalibrate the nerves. Everyone nodded in approval, even if no one was quite sure what recalibrate meant. Writers and philosophers were especially guilty. Entire literary salons were filled with men reclining on velvet sofas, debating metaphysics while slowly sinking into the upholstery. Some wrote entire essays while dosed, often with titles like On the Nature of Stillness or Why Birds Probably Understand Me. At one point it was said that no serious artist in Spain was undrugged. A sober painter was considered suspicious. A poet who didn't dose was accused of being too literal. Even theater critics, historically immune to joy, began praising performances based on how gently they induced drowsiness. An excellent Hamlet, one review I only nodded off twice. The real danger, of course, was that the signs of addiction looked exactly like the signs of refinement: fragility, sleepiness, emotional volatility and the tendency to stare wistfully at furniture. These were admired traits. One could be completely incapacitated and society would still whisper, "Such depth, such suffering, such impeccable taste in scarves." As morphine use increased, some households even developed etiquette around it. You didn't just pour a dose like a barbarian, no, there were serving rituals: a cut glass decanter, a velvet napkin, a soft bell to signal "Please refill." Me. I'm contemplating the void. Of course there were downsides. Dinner parties sometimes dissolved into guests gently falling asleep in soup. One art exhibit had to be closed after 3 critics fell unconscious in front of an abstract goat. And the most respectable man in one Madrid neighborhood famously sleepwalked into a fountain mid-soliloquy clutching a prescription like a declaration of love. But even then no one judged him. They just helped him out, brushed off his hat and said, "Ah." The respectable struggle continues, because in this era addiction didn't always hide in shame. Sometimes it wore lace gloves, spoke 3 languages and forgot what day it was, but remembered the name of every Roman emperor. And really isn't that what elegance is all about? Cafes buzzed with writers, philosophers, and the odd pharmacist on break. Conversations ranged from politics to metaphysics, and sometimes someone would accidentally nod off mid-argument. You haven't lived until you've watched a poetry slam turn into a group nap. Picture a smoky cafe in Madrid around 1907. Wooden chairs, marble-topped tables and a mix of chatter and clinking. China swirl beneath the hazy glow of oil lamps. Outside, the city pulses with noise, street vendors, horse hooves, a dog barking at nothing in particular. But inside time is elastic. You step in and the first thing you notice isn't the aroma of roasted coffee or the cigarette haze. No, it's a different scent, sweet, sharp and vaguely medicinal, hanging in the air like a secret handshake. This is the era of the Spanish café as nerve center. If you were anyone with ideas, ambitions, or an especially noisy household, you ended up here, the regulars, bohemians in long scarves, artists with paint on their cuffs. Students arguing about the purpose of existence and doctors in need of a break from their own prescriptions. At every table, someone is talking too fast, someone is talking too slow, and at least one person is staring Dre into a cup of something that is definitely not just coffee, because cafés weren't just about caffeine. They were about curiosity and, thanks to the times, a generous splash of chemical calm. It wasn't unusual for a server to bring a special tonic with your espresso. Sometimes it was a coded order, the usual, but for the nerves, the tonic would arrive in a small glass bottle nestled in a saucer next to a sugar cube and a lemon twist. For some this was a morning ritual, for others it was insurance against having to listen to another debate about the moral implications of cheese. And then there was the music, the age of jazz and flamenco, played by wiry men in flat caps, their fingers flying or lazily wandering the keys, depending on the dose. Sometimes a trumpet would trill, the room would vibrate with energy and suddenly silence as half the audience drifted into a comfortable doze mid-chorus. The applause was always soft and slightly off-rhythm. Writers loved the café's sleepy chaos. Some claimed the low hum of voices helped them think. Others said the morphine in their tonic helped them not think at all. Pages filled with poetry, manifestos, letters to editors and crushes alike. An aspiring novelist named Anna once spent 5 hours staring at a single word before announcing, "I have decided on a comma." Her companion celebrated with another round of tonics and a brief discussion about whether commas had souls. In the afternoons, philosophers and armchair psychologists gathered ready to solve the problems of the world in between sips. It was all very earnest until someone's morphine-laced cordial kicked in and the big debate on free will was put on hold for a collective meditation on ceiling tiles. One man claimed he'd achieved enlightenment right there in a cafe, though it turned out he was just very, very relaxed and had forgotten how to stand up. There were hazards, of course. On slow days, patrons fell asleep so completely that waiters gently stacked bread rolls on their heads. A particularly lively political argument once ended when both sides lost their train of thought, agreed on a tie and ordered more cake. Artists accidentally dipped their brushes in someone's medicinal syrup and painted 3 paintings before realizing the colors were all slightly horizontal. But no one minded. If you spilled your tonic, a neighbor would pour you another. If you lost the thread of a story, someone else would make up a new ending. The café was a sanctuary of half-finished sentences and gentle dreams. As dusk fell and the city outside grew sharp and noisy again, the café crowd lingered, savoring that last dreamy sip, the last lazy note of guitar and the comfort of knowing that for a few hours the world had slowed down to the pace of a conversation. Because in the 1900s Spain the real art of café culture wasn't just about coffee or jazz. It was about finding a little peace and good company, with just a dash of morphine to keep the worries at bay. Ever wondered why so many famous Spanish artists painted melting clocks or saved dogs? Spoiler, it wasn't just the wine. Some evenings, Salvador Dali wasn't the only one seeing things that weren't there. By the early 1900s, Spain's creative circles had thoroughly embraced morphine as a muse. Painters, poets, musicians, even players. The vanguard and the quietly anxious found inspiration in the bottom of a small brown bottle. In a country where suffering was practically an art form, being a bit off was suddenly the height of style. Step into a Madrid artist's studio in 1908. Sunlight drips through a grimy window onto a floor covered in paint splatters, crumpled sonnets and at least 3 unfinished still lives of pears. The air buzzes with ambition, wood smoke and a faint aroma of medicinal syrup. The walls are covered in canvases, some recognizable, some resembling the results of a duel between a chicken and a paintbrush. And there in the center, the artist reclines, one hand poised over a blank canvas, the other wrapped around a dainty glass of creative tonic. For inspiration, you see, or for nerves, which was a perfectly good excuse for anyone who wanted to take a nap in the middle of composing a sonata. It wasn't just an affectation. Spanish artists had a long history of romantic suffering. The 1900s added pharmacological flourish. It became fashionable to be dramatic and exhausted, to suffer for one's art and, if possible, to look slightly glazed while doing it. Some boasted that their best work came from a place between sleep and waking. One poet insisted his greatest verse came to him during a 3-day inspiration nap. He later admitted he'd forgotten the lines but felt they were probably quite good. And morphine didn't just influence art, it changed the way artists behaved. Gallery openings became dreamy affairs, viewers drifting from painting to painting, pausing to discuss the tragic melancholy of a blue triangle or the subtle existential longing of a slightly crooked vase. Some attendees forgot they were even at an exhibition and spent an hour staring thoughtfully at the coat rack. Writers, meanwhile, dabbled in drowsy realism. Novels meandered, endings trailed off into ellipses. One short story published to critical acclaim was later discovered to be the author's shopping list transcribed. During a particularly enthusiastic evening with a morphine lozenge, musicians composed waltzes that never quite resolved, as if the melody had grown tired and decided to lie down. Being a bit off was celebrated if you started a sentence and then forgot where you were going with it. Artistic genius if you dressed in mismatched shoes, wore a hat to bed or muttered about the emotional lives of pigeons, you were just expressing your unique perspective. At salons, people swapped stories of visions, dreams and near mystical misunderstandings. One sculptor claimed to have discovered the meaning of life in the shape of a bread roll, only to forget it halfway through a nap. The wider public played along. Regular folks envied the creative class's eccentricity. Young students faked deep sighs and tried to look thoughtful. In cafes, sipping weak tonic and hoping for a flash of poetic melancholy, shopkeepers added artist special to their pharmacy shelves, promising gentle inspiration, mild disorientation and a faint longing for the color move. Of course there were hiccups. Gallery owners sometimes had to wake dozing patrons before closing. Musicians missed cues. A particularly prestigious poetry reading ended when 3 out of 5 poets fell asleep mid-verse. The crowd applauded anyway, mostly relieved for the intermission. Still for a while, morphine gave Spain's art scene a dreamy edge. Boundaries blurred, imagination soared. The ordinary felt just a little strange, and the strange somehow felt ordinary. So if you've ever stared at a painting and wondered what was the artist thinking, the answer might be absolutely nothing, and that in the 1900s, Spain was the most creative place to be. If you mixed morphine with cherry, lemon peel and a healthy disregard for side effects, you had yourself a Spanish remedy. Recipes varied by region, but the results were the same, total oblivion plus citrus. By the turn of the 20th century, pharmacies and back kitchens across Spain were locked in a full-fledged elixir arms race. No ailment was too minor, no complaint too vague to escape the soothing promise of a universal tonic. Did your knees hurt? Was your spirit heavy? Had your neighbor looked at you funny? There was a bottle for that. It began with the basics, morphine syrup, imported or made locally by pharmacists with steady hands and blurry ethics. But why stop there? Enter the age of elixirs, liquids that could, according to their wildly optimistic labels, restore lost youth, heal heartbreak and possibly make your goats sing. In tune, every pharmacist, apothecary and ambitious grandmother had their own signature recipe. Some insisted on a splash of brandy for fortification, others swore by orange blossom honey, a pinch of rosemary or, for the truly daring, a dash of basin. To keep things interesting, a few even claimed that the right elixir could ward off curses or at least keep the in-laws from visiting unannounced. These concoctions were beautiful, bottled in colored glass, co-ed with care and labeled in the sort of curly handwriting that promised both healing and a mild fever. Names like Elixir Device, Placid, Elixir of the Placid Life, Calm, Universal and, more bluntly, Radio Pareto, the remedy for everything. For the price of a loaf of bread you could purchase a small glimmering universe of hope and forgetfulness. And people did. They lined up outside pharmacies, clutching coins and shopping lists that read bread onions, nerve syrup, cough drops. The strong kind housewives sent children to the store with empty bottles and a note, fill with something for mother's nerves, preferably the pink 1-inch. One pharmacist became so famous for his celestial comfort cordial that pilgrims traveled 2 towns over, convinced it could cure heartbreak and hiccups in a single sip. Of course, not all elixirs were created equal. Some delivered pure floaty bliss, others tasted like ligament and regret. But the public was undeterred. They swapped recipes at market stalls and family gatherings. A spoonful before bed and you won't wake up until your problems have left the building, claimed one enthusiastic aunt who once slept through her own birthday. As demand exploded, so did creativity. Competing pharmacists tried to outdo each other with ever more elaborate mixtures. One ad promised the only tonic endorsed by poets, priests, and the mayor's second wife. Another claimed their product restores harmony between mind, body and neighbors who play the violin after midnight. There were syrups for melancholy afternoons, losses for the weight of the world and even a chewable calming cube for emotional emergencies, while on the go. Side effects, naturally, were an afterthought. Some bottles, vaguely warned, may induce reflection, stillness, or a desire to hum softly. Others simply suggested best enjoyed with a nap and minimal responsibilities. The bolder ones boasted, "No one's ever finished the bottle in one sitting. Please don't try." Doctors, for their part, alternated between skepticism and envy. Some dismissed the craze as the flavor of the month. Others quietly handed out their own recipes under the counter. If a patient came in claiming the elixir made them float above their troubles, the doctor would nod sagely and say, "Then double the dose and avoid ladders." Eventually, the authorities stepped in, muttering about public safety and unregulated joy. Regulations came, labels got stricter, but the golden age of the Spanish elixir had already left its mark, a fizzy, syrupy chapter in history where hope was bottled. Co-ed and handed out with a slice of lemon and a wink, because, in a world of endless troubles, Spain had discovered its answer. Just mix everything good in one bottle and sip until you forget why you started. It turns out, if everyone is sleepy, productivity goes down. Who knew? Parliament eventually tried to intervene, but politicians themselves seemed unusually chill about the whole thing, possibly because the parliamentary coffee was fortified. For years Spain's morphine moment hummed quietly in the background as ordinary people and the entire upper crust snoozed their way through the industrial age. But eventually a few officials began to sense that something was off. Factory outputs were lagging, schools reported alarming rates of thoughtful silence, and even the post office, usually the backbone of Spanish reliability, developed a reputation for delivering mail when the spirit moved them. Initial suspicions landed on everything except morphine. "Perhaps it's the heat," suggested one minister, "perhaps it's the hats," offered another. But the real issue was finally revealed by a government clear named Juan, who realized that the only thing moving at full speed in Spain was the line at the pharmacy. At first responses were timid. The Ministry of Health commissioned a study run by a panel of elderly men who met once a week and after a quick round of tonics for the nerves, usually lost them to a gender and ended up discussing the price of figs. Early reports were inconclusive, often because the researchers took long naps before finishing their paperwork. Preliminary findings indicate the nation is very, very calm, one memo stated helpfully, but the alarm bells grew louder. Newspapers started publishing stories of mishaps, shopkeepers asleep at the till, teachers snoring through lessons, whole town councils, missing meetings because someone brought cookies, and the rest is a blur. Eventually, a major newspaper ran an exposé under the bold headline, "Are we too calm?" Parliament decided to act, or at least they tried. The first debate on morphine regulation was historic for being the only session where more than half the members fell asleep in their chairs. It was later described as refreshingly civil, if not terribly productive. Eventually, a motion was passed, no one remembered who made it, calling for responsible use and clearer labels, although the actual text was mostly illegible due to coffee stains and a suspicious syrup ring. The government's first real attempt at intervention came in the form of public health posters. Some were poetic: "Awake, Spain. Life needs you. Find your strength in sunlight, not syrup. The future is bright if you're awake for it." Others were more direct: "Morphine is for suffering, not for siesta. Alertness, the national duty." One particularly stern poster simply read, "If you're reading this, please don't nap." Of course, change was slow. The first restrictions limited the sale of morphine to those with genuine need, which, if your doctor was sympathetic, still included having a headache, feeling a bit sad, or anticipating an awkward family dinner. New rules required pharmacists to keep log books, which in practice were filled out whenever someone remembered, sometimes in Latin, but the writing was on the wall, or at least on the napkin next to someone's teacup. Production slowed, imports were monitored, and the government quietly urged doctors to try alternative remedies. Some prescribed walks, fresh air, or cold baths, none of which made anyone nearly as happy as a well-timed elixir. Through all this, the public reacted with mild confusion. Many were too drowsy to protest. Others simply stocked up on extra bottles and began swapping recipes for homemade nerve syrups. The country adjusted gradually and a bit grudgingly to the new reality, feeling your feelings, for better or worse. By the time serious restrictions arrived, Spain was well on its way to a new era, one slightly less peaceful, a bit more irritable and noticeably more awake. The government, for once, had managed to rouse itself in time to steer the nation away from a permanent syrupy siesta. Because when the government finally noticed they didn't just save productivity, they accidentally reintroduced Spain to the concept of Mondays. The jury's still out on whether anyone ever forgave them for that. What happens when the entire city is a little too relaxed? Hospitals fill up with people complaining of fatigue, nightmares, and "I forgot my own birthday again." The real miracle: nurses kept track of anyone at all. A day at Madrid Central Hospital in 1909 was not a scene of frantic medical activity. It was more like a well-choreographed nap, interrupted by the occasional accident. The halls were quiet. Patients shuffled in, drifting between reality and a dream of last week's lunch. Every waiting room had the faint, sweet scent of camphor and morphine, as if someone had accidentally tried to sanitize the building with cough syrup. The patients? A gallery of the gently confused. There was Señorita Luna, who came in every Tuesday complaining that her shoes felt full of clouds. Don Basilica, a banker, who was certain his mustache was talking to him, and Maria from Chamber, who arrived with a letter she'd written herself, addressed naturally to whomever finds me awake. Symptoms ranged from the mundane to the metaphysical: insomnia, unquenchable thirst for lemonade, dreaming so vividly that patients couldn't recall if their neighbors had actually turned into chickens. One woman insisted she was melting a little, which would have worried the staff, had it not become a common refrain. Doctors, for their part, developed a new diagnostic scale: 1, alert and aware. 2, only speaking in metaphors. 3, drowsy but polite. 4, mistook. The 4 stand for a tree. 5, unresponsive but humming a lullaby. Most patients landed between 2 and 4. A lucky few achieved full clarity, usually just before visiting hours or when someone brought chocolate. The staff had to be creative. One nurse invented the shoe reality test, asking, "How many shoes do you see?" as a baseline for consciousness. Another made a game of guessing which patients were genuinely ill and which had just overindulged at the local pharmacy. Hospital routines adapted to the era's sleepy pace. Morning rounds took twice as long. The record for longest uninterrupted nap belonged to Seniors 1, who slept for 17 hours and missed 3 meals, 2 visitors, and the changing of the seasons. He woke up convinced he was a sea captain. The night shifts were surreal. Some patients would wander the corridors gently serenading potted plants or attempting to walk home by circling the ward. Others simply stared at the ceiling, claiming to see poetry in the cracks. The nurses, who were made of stern stuff, herded everyone back to bed, handed out warm compresses and reminded patients, "No, you cannot sign yourself out just because you dreamed you were the mayor." And then there were the morphine mishaps, doses sometimes doubled or mixed up entirely. One well-intentioned orderly accidentally swapped a tray of sedatives with a tray of digestive biscuits. The result, a very calm digestive tract and a group of patients who became philosophers overnight. Does hunger even exist? One mused before falling asleep on a copy of Don Kite. The hospital's greatest challenge was keeping records. Charts were filled with cryptic notes. Patient, lucid, but singing, thinks he's an onion cured, possibly by accident, requesting extra pillow for existential support. Family visits were unpredictable. Sometimes entire families checked themselves in together for rest cures. Visiting hours blurred into nap time. Nurses were often asked to wake everyone for dinner, though dinner itself might be forgotten halfway through. Despite all this, hospital staff managed to keep people alive. If not always fully conscious, they became experts in the art of waking patients gently good morning, it's still Thursday, and learned never to take a patient's first answers seriously. Eventually, as regulations crept in and morphine's hold faded, Madrid's hospital wards got busier, louder and less surreal. But for a few dreamy years, healing in Spain was as much about rest as remedy. A nation of patients snoozing through history and a handful of heroic nurses making sure no one accidentally drifted off for good, because sometimes the best medicine is a nap, just maybe not that many in a row. Spain's morphine epidemic wasn't all siestas and serenity. Sometimes someone would take a little too much and wake up in Portugal or forget they'd already taken a dose 3 times before breakfast. The era was a wild blend of trust and guesswork. While doctors and pharmacists prided themselves on their modern dosing, nobody had invented the concept of safe upper limit. If some is good, more must be wonderful, was the guiding principle of the age. As a result, the stories of accidental overindulgence were legendary, whispered in cafes and confessed somewhat sheepishly in the back pews of church. Take the tale of Señorita Pineda, who once took a double dose before her embroidery class and awoke 48 hours later with the most beautiful but entirely incomprehensible sampler Madrid had ever seen. No one could decipher the message, but critics called it deeply moving, with strong themes of horizontal longing. Or Don Federico, a tax collector with nerves and a penchant for self-medication. One morning, in a noble attempt to face a mountain of paperwork, he combined 3 different nerve tonics recommended by his pharmacist, his aunt and a stranger on the tram. The result, he spent the entire afternoon alphabetizing spoons and apologizing to his coat. His paperwork remained untouched, but his cutlery drawer achieved a legendary level of organization. Not all mishaps happened in private. Some unfolded spectacularly in public. Weddings, for example, were prime territory for accidental overdosing. Brides and grooms were already anxious and well-meaning relatives would quietly slip them an extra calmative. One infamous wedding in Toledo was paused for 2 hours while the happy couple took a nap. Mid-vows the priest dozed off standing up, and the entire congregation politely waited, murmuring, they must truly be in love. Then there were the mix-ups. Bottles weren't always labeled clearly. Some families stored morphine syrup next to the cherry, others in the pantry alongside the vinegar. One tragicomic dinner in Valencia ended with half the guests gently drooling into their gazpacho, while the other half were deeply and inexplicably annoyed about the quality of the salad. Later they realized the oil and vinegar was actually oil, and morphine travel mishaps were their own genre. It was not unheard of for people to wake up in the wrong city or even the wrong country. A legendary case in Salamanca involved a baker named Eugenio who, after just a sip for his back pain, fell asleep on a delivery cart and woke up at a festival in Porto, hailed as the guest of honor for his mysterious, dreamy smile. He stayed for 3 days and remembered none of it, but returned home with a deep appreciation for Portuguese custard tarts. Of course, the animals weren't always spared. In one particularly baffling episode, a family dog consumed a tablespoon of tonic left unattended. The dog spent 12 hours contemplating a loaf of bread and, upon waking, seemed to have gained a new respect for the slow life. Local cats, however, remained unimpressed. The consequences were sometimes serious, but more often they were simply absurd. Lost time, misplaced shoes, forgotten errands, and a national collection of half-finished chores became the stuff of legend. The phrase "oops too much" was whispered like a folk proverb and, in more than one household, immortalized in cross-stitch. As the years rolled on and awareness slowly increased, mishaps became less common, helped by stricter laws, better labeling, and the simple realization that some naps just aren't worth the price of missing an entire weekend. Still, every family had a story, every street had a tale. Spain, for a time, was the land of beautiful mistakes, gentle misadventures, and the world's sleepiest wedding receptions. Because while morphine promised peace, it also delivered the occasional, spectacularly drowsy disaster, and that, in its own way, became a national pastime. Even nuns weren't immune. Convents became infamous for their healing tonics, and prayers grew longer, slower, and slightly more psychedelic. The Virgin Mary appeared to be very, very patient. The convent, for centuries, had been a place of quiet discipline, bells ringing at ungodly hours, floors scrubbed with holy determination, and daily life ruled by strict schedules. But with the arrival of morphine, all that devotion found itself a little more relaxed. Sisters who once marched to the rhythm of the chapel bell now strolled, hummed, and in one memorable case, were found meditating with the laundry for 2 hours straight. It started innocently enough. Morphine was, after all, recommended by local doctors for aches, headaches, excessive worry, and the unique spiritual fatigue that comes from being in charge of Reward Orphans, Illinois. Parishioners and endless embroidery. A spoonful in the infirmary cabinet became standard, soon a bottle for the head nun, one for Sister Magdalena's knees, and another just in case of general malaise. Soon healing tonics became the convent's open secret. If a sister felt spiritually heavy or found herself nodding off in prayer, the remedy was always the same: a little tonic, whispered Sister Carrara. But don't let Sister Beatrice measure. Last time she put half the bottle in my tea and I spent 3 days thinking the rosary was a garland of sausages. Laughter, soft of course, became more common in the hallways. Daily routines, slowed prayers, which used to last an hour, now stretched luxuriously into the afternoon. Gregorian chants turned dreamlike, the Latin syllables swirling together, sometimes dissolving into humming. Novices, once anxious about every mistake, became serenely confident that God probably didn't mind a little improvisation. "Our Lord loves creativity," Sister Pillar said while embroidering sunflowers instead of lies on the altar cloth. The effects rippled through the community. Orphans noticed the sisters smiled more and scolded less. Neighbors peeking through the convent gates remarked that the garden was never so peaceful or so thoroughly weeded. The nuns tended to every task with gentle patience that frankly alarmed the local priest. He wondered aloud whether sainthood was contagious or if the sisters had found a particularly good herbalist. The bishop, after a lengthy visit, left feeling unusually calm and spent the next week singing to the rectory cats. Of course, as with all things, there were mishaps. One evening the bell for Vespers was never rung because the bell ringer had fallen asleep misstep clutching a prayer book in an empty tonic glass. Another day the bread came out of the oven looking perfect but was later discovered to be filled with lavender and 3 spoonfuls of the special syrup. The nuns declared it the most restful lunch in years. Visitors came seeking healing, sometimes for illness, sometimes for peace of mind. The sisters greeted them with open arms, a cup of tea and, if the guests seemed especially harried, a little something for tranquility. Many left convinced they'd received not just spiritual guidance but a full mental vacation. One local merchant claimed he hadn't worried about taxes since his last convent visit, but couldn't quite recall how he'd spent his afternoon. Eventually, as regulations tightened and the dangers of overindulgence became clearer, the convents scaled back. The sisters returned to stricter routines, bells ringing on time, bread baked without surprises, prayers delivered at a more earthly pace. Yet the legend of the morphine-infused convent remained, a time when holiness and harmony mingled with medicinal dreams, and even the most devoted souls took their peace where they could find it. Because in those years even a convent needed a little help to keep faith and nerves intact. And if the Virgin Mary looked a little more patient, perhaps it was simply because she understood. Sometimes everyone deserves a rest. Dinner table conversations shifted, kids got away with more, parents forgot to argue, and family secrets came out, then were forgotten, then came out again. Memory was a fragile thing in 1907. Before morphine, Spanish families were famous for their lively, sometimes volcanic dinner debates, grandparents arguing about soup, children defending their right to extra bread, uncles feuding over politics, football and who borrowed whose shovel. Every meal was an event, sometimes a battle, and always memorable. But as morphine seeped quietly into daily routines, things changed. The arguments didn't just cool down, they faded out altogether. One minute someone would be complaining about the noise from next door. The next they'd trail off mid-sentence, lost in the gentle, syrupy haze of a well-timed tonic. Mothers forgot to scold, fathers forgot why they were angry. Children sensed opportunity. Little by little, family rules loosened. "Did you brush your teeth?" was met with vague nods and softer follow-ups. "Well, at least you tried." Siblings who'd once bickered over, who got the bigger slice of flan, now gazed dry at their plates, happy just to have dessert. If a child snuck extra honey or confessed to accidentally painting the goat, the reaction was likely a gentle sigh and a reminder to try not to do it again, if you remember. And then there were the secrets. Oh, the secrets. Morphine loosened tongues but clouded memories. Grandmothers spilled decades-old family gossip over dinner, only to deny it completely by breakfast. Children revealed their mischief, then watched with awe as their parents forgot to ground them. Family scandals surfaced and sometimes sunk in the same conversation. "Did you hear about Uncle Jose and the—" "Oh, never mind. What were we talking about?" Weekly routines, blurred. Chores were started, abandoned, rediscovered and sometimes completed. The house was full of half-finished projects, a new shelf, a pie crust, a letter to a cousin in Toledo. Someone would remember to water the plants, but forget which plants belonged inside. Still, for all the confusion, there was a kind of peace, fewer arguments, softer voices. Even the family pets seemed calmer, content to doze in laps, while the humans forgot whether it was Tuesday or Sunday. Photos from the era show families clustered around dinner tables, half smiling, half blinking, as if trying to remember what it was they just said. The morphine era didn't make Spanish families perfect, but it made them quieter, gentler and sometimes, honestly, just a little more forgiving. Yes, memories got jumbled. Yes, the arguments and scandals would eventually return, but for a while, family life was less about shouting and more about simply being together, even if nobody could quite recall what happened at dinner last night, because sometimes the best kind of family secret is the one that everyone forgets. At the same time, behind every counter, there was a code: "Would you like something for your nerves?" Really meant, "Are you ready for a nap that lasts until next week?" Pharmacists became the unofficial therapists of Spain, just with fewer boundaries. It's easy to imagine the scene, a narrow shop with worn wooden floors, shelves lined with amber bottles and the comforting whiff of camphor peppermint and hope. You approach the counter clutching a crumpled list and a vague complaint about tension or restlessness. The pharmacist, respected and infinitely patient, leans in and asks in a hushed tone, "Do you need the blue bottle today or something a bit stronger?" No one ever explained what stronger meant. You just nodded, and the prescription was filled accordingly. In this world, pharmacy was part retail, part performance art. Customers didn't ask for morphine by name. It was all about euphemisms. A restorative, please, something for the weather. My husband is home all day. Each phrase translated into a different concoction mixed with a knowing wink and a gentle warning to take only as much as you need or as much as you can remember. Pharmacists developed their own dialect, a blend of professional jargon, neighborhood gossip and the kind of coded language usually reserved for magicians and spies. "I see your sister's cat has been anxious again. Perhaps you need an extra vial," meant. "I know things are rough at home. Let's double your order. The teacher's been coming in more often," whispered one apothecary to another. "So stock up on the calming drops." There were unspoken rules. You never questioned the bottle you received. If a pharmacist told you this will help you sleep, you believed them, even if you woke up 3 days later with the sudden urge to embroider a novel. Some locals tried to guess. The code was for tranquility, milder than for serenity. Did the purple label mean you'd be able to attend Sunday Mass or just dream about it for the next week? But only the pharmacists truly knew. They became experts at reading people's faces. If you hesitated at the counter, you'd receive a smaller dose and a reassuring nod. If you arrived wild-eyed and desperate, you might walk out with an extra bottle and an invitation to return anytime you need to talk. Some customers confided more in their pharmacist than in their priest. After all, priests heard your sins, but pharmacists had the power to help you forget them entirely. Sometimes the language got creative. "Do you have anything for the neighbor's rooster?" Could be code for a stronger sedative, or perhaps just literal. After all, the animals were often as anxious as their owners. A request for that special tonic you gave my aunt last spring was understood instantly, even if no one could recall what exactly had been in it. Of course, the code also kept out busybodies. Outsiders who asked too many questions received only mint tea and vague assurances. But regulars knew the phrases for nerves, for the melancholy weather, for when it all feels a bit much. No one ever needed to spell out morphine. In those days, discretion was the highest form of trust. Over time, as regulations tightened and the great morphine nap finally began to lift, the language of the pharmacists faded. Bottles were labeled with warnings instead of poetry, questions were answered with dosages, not stories. The counter became a place for transactions, not confessions. Yet in memories and the occasional whispered joke among the elderly, the secret language survives, a raised eyebrow, a carefully worded question, a smile that says, "I know what you mean, and I won't tell a soul." For a golden, drowsy era, Spanish pharmacists spoke in a dialect of empathy, suggestion and sleep, because sometimes the most comforting words aren't written on a prescription, they're hidden in a wink and a well-timed bottle. What happens when Spain's bravest matadors discover morphine's numbing effects? The bull isn't the only one confused. Some matches ended in naps, hugs, or impromptu poetry readings in the ring. For centuries, the bull fight was Spain's ultimate test of courage, a spectacle of sharp reflexes, dazzling costumes, and just the right amount of existential dread. The matador was expected to be nimble, precise and unfazed by the prospect of meeting his end by horn or hoof. But all that changed when morphine made its way into the arena. It began, as many things do, with a minor injury, a sprained ankle here, a bruised rib there, and suddenly every terrier in the country wanted to know what the doctor had hidden in that little brown bottle. The first time a matador took a dose before facing a bull, the difference was obvious. He entered the ring with the calm of a monk and the flexibility of a man who just slept for 14 hours. His movements were dreamy, his posture perfect, if a bit slow. The crowd noticed he moves like poetry. One spectator sighed as the matador seemed to float rather than dart. Another whispered, "Has he fallen asleep?" As the man paused mid-pass to contemplate the sunset, the bull, meanwhile, seemed equally perplexed, sometimes pausing itself as if unsure whether to charge or join the nap. Word spread quickly through the circuit. Morphine became the Nostoc secret weapon of the bull ring, an invisible armor that dulled both pain and panic. Wounded terraces returned to the arena far sooner than anyone thought wise, cheered on by crowds who had no idea their hero was only half aware of which side of the cape was up. Trainers slipped a little something for the nerves into their fighter. Coffee apothecaries made quiet deliveries at the back gate, greeted by sweaty, grateful matadors in glittering suits. Some matches grew downright surreal. There was the infamous Seville event where the matador, overcome by the gentle haze of his pre-fight dose, mistook the bull for an old friend and tried to shake its hoof. On another occasion, a poetry-inclined toro recited verses to the bewildered animal, declaring, "Your eyes are the windows to a world I'll never understand." The bull, either flattered or completely baffled, simply stared back. Not all effects were so charming. Sometimes timing was lost. A matador might stand his ground just a bit too long or forget whether he was supposed to faint. Left or right, there were long, awkward silences, broken only by the soft snoring of a dozing fighter. In the midday, Sunday, bulls, long revered for their instincts, began looking around for hidden snacks or, in one legendary case, tried to nap next to the matador. Spectators soon adapted. The thrill of danger was replaced by the thrill of unpredictability. Would today's fight end in cheers, confusion or a spontaneous siesta? Was that a dramatic new maneuver, or did the terrier just forget where he was? Sometimes the event ended with both man and beast walking peacefully out of the ring, neither entirely sure who had won. Eventually, officials tried to intervene. Regulations were proposed: no sedatives within 12 hours of entering the ring. Enforcement was half-hearted. Some matadors simply switched to more creative euphemisms: "It's just for my nerves, senors and the apothecaries." They never asked questions, they just filled the bottles. As the morphine era waned and the haze lifted, bullfighting regained its old urgency. The naps, the poetry and the accidental truce between matador and bull faded into legend. But for a few dreamy years, the arena was less about victory and more about vibe, a place where courage and calm shared the same cape. Because when morphine met bullfighting, the bravest didn't always win. Sometimes they just forgot to lose. When is a problem not a problem? When no one wants to talk about it. Spain's morphine users mastered the art of pretending everything was fine, even when half the family was sleepwalking through Sunday Mass. It started with little things. People would arrive late to meetings, apologizing with vague smiles and stories about bad dreams or unexpected naps. Grandmothers who had once ruled the home with iron ladles now spent entire afternoons lost in their rocking chairs, humming the same 3 notes and gazing lovingly at wallpaper. The local priest noticed that confessions were quieter, less frantic. Sins became dreamy and ambiguous. "Forgive me, Father, for something. I think it involved a pie," but if anyone dared suggest that maybe, just maybe, Spain had a morphine problem, they were met with shocked denial. "Who, me?" was the standard reply, often delivered while holding a spoon still sticky with syrup. "It's just for the nerves. I barely touched the stuff." Everyone needs a little help these days, don't they? Even the local dogs, suspiciously relaxed, were said to be just tired from all. The barking denial became a national sport. Doctors whose offices overflowed with patients seeking just a little more of the good tonic began to see the signs but dismissed them as modern fatigue. If a patient forgot their appointment, it was the weather. If they nodded off mid-sentence, it was stress. If they slept for 2 days and missed their cousin's wedding, well, those were long vows anyway. Pharmacists who knew exactly how many bottles were leaving their shops each week quietly ignored the math. When the city council commissioned a study into the growing culture of lethargy, the lead researcher submitted his report 3 months late and claimed he'd misplaced the results somewhere in the pantry. His colleagues nodded understandingly and went back to organizing their sock drawers. Even as symptoms piled up, nobody wanted to use the word addiction. It sounded so French or, worse, modern. It was easier to blame old age, weak nerves, politics or something in the soup. Children were said to be going through a quiet phase. Husbands explained away their absence of opinion, as deep-thinking wives who used to remember every slight and every recipe suddenly couldn't recall where they'd put the sugar. Or why they'd wandered into the kitchen in the first place. If a neighbor brought up the topic, the whole street bristled. We're not like those people in the next barrier. If the mayor's wife seemed a bit too cheerful at market, well, she must just be blessed with a peaceful spirit. And if the pharmacist's son started selling study syrup to his classmates, it was written off as youthful entrepreneurship. Churches were packed, but mostly with worshippers gently dozing in the pews. Sermons about temptation and vigilance fell on blissfully inattentive ears. The priest himself, rumored to have the best remedy for nerves in the parish, started sermons with extra enthusiasm, but sometimes ended them with long silent pauses and a dreamy smile. Denial was contagious. Families would sit around the table passing the bottle and laughing off the suggestion that anything was amiss. Your uncle has always been a little slow after lunch. That's just how Cousin Magdalena is. She's sensitive. It's normal to need 2 naps a day. The times are stressful. Meanwhile, dinner conversation drifted, chores went undone, and family secrets floated to the surface, only to drift away again unexamined. There were moments, of course, when the mask slipped, someone would forget to dose and the world would suddenly feel sharp and loud. The kids would start fighting, the dog would bark and the neighbor's constant accordion practice would become unbearable. On those rare days, the urge to return to the bottle was overwhelming and any suggestion to just try some tea was met with horror, even as awareness slowly grew. The first reaction was denial, followed immediately by denial of the denial. I'm not addicted, people said. And even if I were, it's not a problem. I could stop any time, declared one gentleman right after siesta. One housewife assured her friends she'd gone days without, but upon checking her calendar, realized she'd only managed half a morning. It was, in the end, a kind of national theater, everyone pretending not to notice, all while sleepwalking through life, convinced that peace must be natural if everyone shares it. Denial wasn't just a coping strategy. It was a lifestyle, an art, a group agreement that reality could be gently postponed. And if someone insisted on facing the truth, well, that was just another problem best handled after a nice long nap. Inevitably, the media caught on, headlines blared, scandals erupted and suddenly everyone was shocked. Shocked to learn that their dentist's waiting room was basically a peak-easy. It started, as most scandals do, with one nosy reporter and a little too much curiosity. La Certa de Madrid, desperate for a headline splashier than Mayor opens new public bench, sent their junior journalist to cover a story about unusual quiet in local schools. The reporter returned 3 days later with a pocket full of empty tonic bottles, a list of suspiciously well-rested teachers and a burning question: why is everyone so agreeable? Within a week, newspapers ran exposes with headlines like, "City sleeps while danger lurks, morphine madness. Are we too calm, dentist or drowsy dealer?" The press sniffed around every corner. They found foundries with back rooms full of special orders. They discovered society ladies swapping morphine recipes at afternoon tea. Furthermore, they even cornered a bewildered dentist whose waiting room was infamous for being so tranquil that patients would nod off before even hearing the drill. "I thought they were just relaxed," he protested. Who knew his protest was not believed? The public was scandalized, at least in theory. Everyone pretended to be surprised, clutching their pearls or more likely, their tonic bottles, and declaring they had no idea that half the city was dozing through life on a chemical cloud. Dinner parties buzzed with gossip. Did you hear about DA Mercedes? I always suspected the mayor's handshake was a little too limp. No wonder the bread lines have been so quiet. Authorities scrambled to respond. The Ministry of Health convened an emergency meeting which lasted all of 12 minutes before most attendees drifted off and the minutes takers started doodling syringes. The mayor gave a rousing speech about the integrity of our great city, during which he nearly nodded off at the podium. Police raided 3 pharmacies in the heart of Madrid only to find long lines of patients already there, calmly awaiting their sleepy syrup worse. The scandal touched the elite. A celebrated opera singer was caught with a flask labeled for artistic inspiration and stage fright. A bishop was found in possession of divine drops for meditation. Even the city's most respectable children's author was revealed to have written his last 4 books with the help of a spoonful before each chapter. His characters, in retrospect, were suspiciously fond of naps. Of course, no one took responsibility. Doctors blamed patients for insisting on the strongest remedies. Patients blamed doctors for encouraging modern cures. Pharmacists blamed the Germans. The Germans, for their part, seemed unbothered. The scandal was not contained to Madrid. Rural towns got involved. Newspapers reported on entire villages whose productivity had fallen to near zero. One town council meeting was famously interrupted when every member save the secretary fell asleep at the table. The secretary, seizing the opportunity, passed 3 measures for new street lamps and a personal raise. As the media frenzy peaked, rumors flourished. Was the water supply contaminated with morphine? It wasn't. Had someone spiked the communion wine? Unclear, but attendance was up. Did the city's pigeons seem calmer than usual? Possibly, but no one could catch one to ask. And then there were the conspiracy theories, secret societies of pharmacists, coded messages in the classified ads. Even the royal family was rumored to have a secret stash, though, in fairness, the king was known for his 12-hour naps and impressive collection of velvet bathrobes. In response to the uproar, the government vowed action. New regulations were rushed through Parliament, banning unnecessary sedatives and requiring pharmacies to keep logs of every sale. Labels were redesigned to be as frightening as possible, featuring skulls, crossbones and dire warnings about drowsiness, dependency and missing your own birthday. The black market naturally exploded overnight, but officially the city began to sober up. Productivity rose, church sermons ran longer, dinner parties got louder and, according to most, much less interesting. In the years that followed, the Great Morphine Scandal of 1912 was blamed for everything from missed harvests to bad poetry. But beneath the public outrage there was a certain wistfulness. People missed the hush, the harmony, the days when just a little tonic could smooth away the edges of a hard world. Still, for one strange season, Spain's secrets were front-page news, and while the bottles were swept off the shelves, the memories and the jokes remained, because sometimes the real scandal isn't what happens in the back room, it's realizing the whole town was in on it, and the only thing anyone really lost was a very good nap. No fancy clinics, no support groups, just stern priests, strong coffee and the kind of family intervention that involved a lot of shouting and occasionally a goat. Recovery was possible, but only if you could remember why you were trying. It wasn't a glamorous process in the days before psychology became fashionable and therapy was something you did outside the confessional. Quitting morphine was considered less a medical journey and more a family project. The moment someone suspected you were too calm for your own good, the wheels of intervention began to turn. Grandmothers noticed when you stopped arguing about stew. The local shopkeeper whispered that you seemed even sleepier than usual. And if your morning routine involved a little too much time with this back door, it was only a matter of time before someone took action. The Spanish approach to rehab was rooted in three things: faith, family, and caffeine. The first step, a stern priest. Priests in those days didn't just offer forgiveness, they offered discipline. It started with a long, uncomfortable confession. The penitent would mumble, "Forgive me, Father, for I have dozed." And the priest would respond, "We're all a little tired. But the Lord helps those who help themselves and those who drink less syrup." The real work began with penance, cold morning masses, additional chores, and enough rosaries to make your fingers ache. Next came the family intervention, an event that made local weddings look low-key by comparison. Relatives gathered, armed with good intentions, herbal teas, and an arsenal of supportive shouting. "You're sleeping through your life. You missed your cousin's engagement and possibly your own." The intervention usually included at least one family member dramatically swearing off sugar in solidarity, someone miscuing a proverb about willpower, and if the family owned a goat. The animal was brought in for emphasis, either as comic relief or, in one famous case, as a reminder that even goats had things to do besides nap. And then coffee. Endless bracing, slightly burnt coffee. Forget detox smoothies. Spain's answer to withdrawal was to drown you in caffeine and hope your heart would wake up before your mind noticed what was happening. Recovery days began with a pot of coffee strong enough to remove paint from furniture, followed by another pot for luck. If you nodded off mid-cap, someone would bang on the table and shout, "Arab, get up until you return to the land of the living." The withdrawal itself was memorable. There were headaches, sure, but also a noting restlessness. The first week was the worst. You'd lie awake, eyes wide, counting ceiling cracks and swearing, never to touch a tonic again. Food lost its flavor. Neighbors' voices grated on your nerves. The family dog seemed personally offended by your return to consciousness. "Welcome back," your grandmother would say. "We missed your complaining without professional therapy." Support came in whatever form the community could muster. There were friends who took you for long walks, not for fresh air, but to keep you from sneaking to the apothecary. The local barber, usually a man of few words, suddenly became your chief motivator, offering unsolicited advice while trimming your hair twice a week just to check on your progress. The baker slipped you extra bread. The priest offered twice the usual prayers. If you made it to Sunday Mass without dozing, someone might even bake you a celebratory cake, coffee flavored naturally. Relapses happened, of course. One memorable incident involved a farmer who, unable to resist, disguised himself as his own mother to get a new prescription. He was caught when he tripped over his own beard and confessed mid-fall. The townsfolk didn't shame him. Instead, they patted him on the back and reminded him, "Try again, but wear better shoes." Ultimately, Spanish-style rehab was a collective effort. There were no clinics, but there was plenty of community spirit, sometimes smothering, always loud and never subtle. Healing wasn't a solitary journey, but a team sport played at the volume of a football match. Success was celebrated with hugs, cake and promises to keep a closer eye on each other and perhaps for all its mess and noise. That's why some people really did break the habit, not because of discipline alone, but because waking up in Spain meant waking up to a chorus of friends. And family, a kitchen full of burnt coffee and a goat who'd rather have you cranky and present than asleep and absent. Because, in the end, Spanish-style rehab wasn't about doing it alone. It was about being reminded loudly and often that, even if you forget why you're trying, there's a whole village determined to help you. Remember, some folks managed to dodge addiction entirely, mostly by running out of money, losing their prescription pad or accidentally switching to wine. These were the true survivors of the epidemic. To outsiders, they were a mystery in a time when half of Spain seemed to be floating dray through life. These individuals somehow kept both feet on the ground and their wits intact. Mostly, the town gossip speculated endlessly. Did they possess iron willpower, secret knowledge, or were they simply too disorganized to keep up with the rest of the country's restorative rituals? Let's begin with the most obvious group, the chronically broken. For many, morphine was a luxury, no matter how much the local apothecary tried to market it as an everyday staple like bread or gossip. The bottles weren't cheap. When money ran out, so did access to sweet oblivion. The local butcher, for example, swore by his nerves tonic for exactly 3 weeks in 1908, until he realized he could either afford his favorite morphine syrup or pay his wife's shoe bill. He chose shoes, lived to tell the tale, and spent the rest of his life declaring that discipline is the best medicine, while quietly resenting anyone who still had both. Then there were the scatterbrains, the ones who could never remember to get their prescription refilled. These accidental tea towers walked intimacies confidently, only to find their pockets empty or their doctor's note lost somewhere in the folds of last winter's coat. They'd leave with nothing but a small tin of peppermints, forced to confront life's irritations the old-fashioned way, loudly and frequently. A small but proud minority switched substances by mistake or opportunity. They arrived at family gatherings intending to dose up only to find Uncle André had already finished the last bottle not to be left out. They reached for whatever was handy: wine, cherry, sometimes a mug of thick black coffee, and discovered, quite by accident, that life was tolerable without morphine. "I just started drinking Rio," confided one survivor, "and I still forget my worries, but now I remember them again by dinner." Others credited their escape to the sheer complexity of remembering dosing schedules. If it required more than 2 steps or didn't come in a bottle shaped like a duck, it was simply too much trouble. Some, of course, escaped through sheer stubbornness. The village school teacher, famous for her constitution of steel, refused all tonics on principle. "I don't need medicine," she sniffed. "I have my students to keep me on my toes." Years later, her students would recall her lessons less for the curriculum and more for the loud slamming of rulers and her war on woolly thinking. She lived to 90, slightly deaf but fully awake. A few more managed to avoid addiction thanks to inconvenient relatives. Take the case of Senora Polar, whose mother-in-law insisted on borrowing every bottle in the house for emergencies. Polar soon learned it was easier to just stop buying the stuff than to listen to nightly lectures about proper use and spiritual hygiene. Pharmacists themselves sometimes played a role. There was a secret code among the most ethical: if a customer started looking a little too relaxed, the pharmacist would run out of supplies or suggest a new batch was delayed by the weather in Valencia. To the regulars, this was simply an annoyance. To those on the verge of dependency, it was a lucky break. Some pharmacists even began quietly substituting harmless syrups, counting on the placebo effect and the power of suggestion to see their customers through the rough patch. And then there were the happy accidents: children who swapped the morphine bottle for elderflower cordial before dinner, parents who mixed up the tonic with cough syrup, and one legendary case in which a priest accidentally blessed a bottle of wine instead of elixir of saintly repose, sparking a minor miracle and a lot of relieved parishioners. By the end of the epidemic, those who'd managed to avoid addiction had developed a certain pride, bordering on smugness. "I never needed the stuff," they'd say, as if willpower alone had done the job, conveniently forgetting all the mishaps and missed opportunities that had actually saved them. Their families told stories of lost prescriptions, empty purses and disastrous dinners. But the legend stuck. These survivors became the sages of the post-morphine era, doing out advice and strong opinions with a twinkle in their eye and usually a glass of something non-medical in their hand, because sometimes beating addiction isn't about strength or foresight, it's about bad luck, lost paperwork and just enough confusion to miss your dose. Even after the laws changed, the nation didn't exactly spring back to life. For years, Spain was known for its epic siestas, laid-back lifestyle and suspiciously well-rested grandparents. When the morphine bottles were finally swept from pharmacy shelves and the last spoonful doled out, Spain did not leap to its feet with newfound vigor. Instead, it rolled over, muttered something about 5 more minutes and pulled the covers a little tighter. The habits of decades don't vanish overnight, and in the wake of the morphine era, Spain settled into a new normal, one defined by yawns, naps and a collective memory that sometimes felt a little too dreamlike to be true. Children born in the years after the Great Morphine Crackdown grew up surrounded by stories not just of the epidemic itself, but of the golden age of relaxation. Grandparents who had survived the storm became legendary for their ability to nap anywhere anytime, park benches, church pews, the middle of a bustling market, no place was off limits. Family gatherings were marked by long, comfortable silences and the uncanny talent for dozing off in the middle of a sentence. There was always someone snoring gently in the background, a reassuring soundtrack to daily life. These grandparents became local celebrities. They taught the young how to perfect the art of the siesta, not too short, not too long, ideally taken after lunch with a window open and a cat nearby. The secret, one elderly matriarch explained, is to never fight the urge. When sleep calls, you answer. The world will wait. Children would giggle as their abbot fell asleep at the dinner table, fork in midair, only to wake up and finish his story as if nothing had happened. But the legacy was about more than sleep. The old morphine calm lingered in the culture, diffused into the rhythms of daily life. Spain's reputation for unhurried afternoons, patient lines, and the sacredness of Nana, meaning not today and maybe not tomorrow either, became world famous. Foreigners marveled at the nation's collective serenity and wondered what secret herb or ancient wisdom powered it all. Little did they know the secret ingredient was mostly inertia. Even as the rest of Europe marched through the 20th century, with relentless energy, factories, roaring cities, sprawling, Spain took its time. Innovations arrived, but so did more holidays, bureaucratic delays became legendary. The Spanish post office once took 2 weeks to deliver a letter from Madrid to Toledo, and no one minded because the recipient was probably napping anyway. Of course, not everyone approved. A new generation of reformers, alert, energetic and slightly suspicious of naps, tried to shake things up. Let's move faster, they said, let's modernize. The older generation, however, was not so easily roused. We already survived one great awakening, they replied, and frankly, we prefer the old way. Even efforts to cut down on siestas met fierce resistance. Shopkeepers unionized in defense of afternoon closing, claiming it was a cultural heritage. No one argued too hard lest they disturb the peace. The sleepiest generation also passed down a kind of emotional wisdom. With all those hours spent in tranquil contemplation or medicated haze, they learned to let the small things go. Arguments were rare and brief. Life's annoyances, bad weather, slow trains, noisy neighbors were met with a shrug and a promise that it will all sort itself out, if not today, then soon, or perhaps after a good rest. There was a humor to it. All the old-timers told tall tales of the morphine years, embellishing with each retelling. Back then I once napped for 3 days straight, one grandfather claimed, and when I woke up I was mayor. Friends laughed, children rolled their eyes, but everyone secretly wished for just a little more of that legendary calm. This legacy shaped Spain's identity for decades. Tourists arriving in Madrid or Barcelona marveled at the leisurely pace. How do you all stay so relaxed, they'd ask while impatiently checking their watches. The answer was always the same, life is long. Why rush? If pressed, some locals would wink and add, our grandparents taught us well. Eventually, the world caught up, at least in spirit. Mindfulness, wellness and work-life balance became international obsessions. Spain's sleepiest generation watched as the rest of humanity tried to invent what they'd already mastered, the fine art of taking it easy. Because the true legacy of Spain's morphine years wasn't just in empty bottles or forgotten afternoons. It was in the national character, a stubborn, cheerful insistence that nothing is so urgent it can't wait until after your nap. And, as every well-rested aqua knows, tomorrow is another day and the world always looks better after a good sleep. What can we learn from a country that once put morphine in everything but the water supply? For one, always read the label. For another, never underestimate the power of denial, a good nap and strong black coffee. The morphine years in Spain are a cautionary tale dressed up as a daydream. If history teaches us anything, it's that even the best intentions, like soothing your nerves, dulling the aches of life or keeping children from scaling the curtains, can spiral into something that takes decades to untangle. But as with all great blunders, there are lessons worth snoring through. First, the obvious labels matter. It's easy to look back and marvel at the cheerful disregard with which tonics were dosed out in pharmacies, kitchens, and church basement. Take as needed to be said the instructions, leaving the rest to interpretation, whim, or the advice of an elderly aunt who swore by a spoon for luck. Modern medicine is, if nothing else, more specific. Today, a warning label covers half the box. In 1907, Spain, you were lucky if the label wasn't handwritten in Latin, tucked under a doily and still sticky from the last user's thumbprint. The second lesson: denial is universal. If a whole country can pretend that a sleepy population is just tired from the harvest or going through a quiet phase, what can't we ignore? The morphine epidemic wasn't sustained by ignorance alone. It survived on community, a culture of polite non-quests, and a sort of national agreement to squint at reality until it looked a bit softer around the edges. It's a reminder that denial isn't just personal. Furthermore, it can be collective, comforting, and hilariously persistent. But perhaps the most striking lesson is how much people will do and how far they'll go just to avoid discomfort, whether physical, emotional, or existential. Faced with the sharpness of life, Spaniards reached for bottles. When the bottles were taken away, they reached for naps, coffee, poetry, and, eventually, each other. The Spanish morphine era wasn't just about chemistry. It was about coping. When one crutch disappeared, they reached for another and another, until finally discovering, with a mixture of exhaustion and pride, that sometimes you have to stand on your own 2 feet at least long enough to find a chair. This brings us to the true genius of Spain's sleepiest generation. They understood the value of a nap in a world obsessed with productivity, hustle, and waking up at 5 a.m. for no reason. The Spanish approach feels radical. "You must rest," said the grandmothers, and Spain listened. Even after the morphine years faded, the culture of siesta survived, not as laziness but as strategy, because sometimes what the world needs isn't another hour at the grindstone, but 20 minutes in a sunbeam, with your shoes off and nothing but the promise of coffee to get you moving again. Modern life tries to bottle tranquility in other ways. We invent sleep apps, market herbal teas with names like Deep, Dream Bliss, and schedule yoga until we're too tired to stretch, all in the hope of feeling, even for a moment, that soft-edged peace Spain once dispensed by the teaspoon. The difference, at least. Now we're more likely to talk about the side effects, and in the end, coffee wins. As morphine faded from Spanish shelves, coffee took its place, not as a sedative but as a stimulant, a rallying cry, and a substitute for the communal nap. Coffee shops replaced as the center of social life. The rituals shifted. Instead of dosing for oblivion, Spaniards gathered to wake up, to talk, to argue, and to marvel at how much sharper the world seemed when experienced in full caffeinated color. Looking back, it's tempting to mock the mistakes of the past, but it's even more valuable to appreciate the resilience underneath, the ability to muddle through, to adapt, to find new ways to survive and laugh about it later. Spain's morphine saga is a reminder that even the sleepiest mistakes can lead to wisdom, and that sometimes the best way forward is to put down the bottle. Pour another cup and face the day with eyes wide open, even if you need a nap later. So what can we learn? Read the label, don't underestimate denial, trust your grandma's advice about naps, and never, ever let anyone take away your morning coffee, because in the end, history doesn't just repeat itself, it sometimes just drifts off, wakes up confused, and asks for a refill. When expectant mothers in early 1900s, Spain were prescribed morphine for nerves, the results were unpredictable. Hospitals saw a sharp rise in suspiciously mellow newborns and a sudden spike in lullabies sung in slow motion. Doctors congratulated themselves, grandmothers took naps. No one remembered to record a single birth weight. It was the era of doctor knows best, and in Spain that meant trusting your local physician's advice, no matter how outlandish. If you were pregnant and overwrought, the answer was simple: take a little morphine or a lot, depending on how many relatives were currently staying in your house. The tonic came in a pretty bottle with instructions written in flourished handwriting that could have said anything really: for tranquility, for sleep, for forgetting that your mother-in-law is living in your pantry, all perfectly acceptable uses. The hospital maternity wards of Madrid, Seville, and every tiny village in between became strangely peaceful places. Nurses remarked that babies arrived as quiet as saints, barely crying, content to snooze through checkups, christenings, and the occasional marching band. Miracle babies, proclaimed one local newspaper, which failed to mention that most of these miracles involved being so relaxed, they barely noticed they'd been born. Doctors were delighted. "We have never seen such calm infants." They boasted and wrote glowing reports about their advanced modern remedies. In private, they worried a little about the baby's odd habit of yawning through their own baptisms, but decided this was a sign of intelligence or, at worst, good manners. Every so often a more skeptical nurse would wonder aloud if perhaps these miracle babies might one day need a little more pep. She was shushed and given a spoonful of the quiet syrup herself. Mothers, meanwhile, felt better, who wouldn't? After being handed a soothing potion for every ache, twinge, and moment of existential dread. There are stories of entire maternity wards where the mothers napped through labor, awoke to gentle applause, and serenely accepted their babies blinking into their arms. One legendary birth involved a woman who slept through her own delivery and had to be gently awakened to choose a name. She picked P.S. Peace at home. The miracle babies continued their campaign of serenity. They didn't fuss at feeding, rarely wailed at bath time, and took to swaddling like tiny, drowsy monks. Grandmothers bragged about their angelic new grandchildren, insisting this was how babies were supposed to behave: quiet, undemanding, content to drift through early life with the placid calm of a cat on a warm window sill. But as time went on, the side effects began to reveal themselves in curious ways. School teachers noticed a new generation of children who could nap anywhere and remain serenely unbothered by chalk lessons or the sound of goats crashing through the playground. Priests commented on the unprecedented stillness of First Communion ceremonies. "They're so composed," they said, "so dreamy." No one realized just yet that Spain was raising the world's first fully tranquilized class. Of course there were hiccups. Some miracle babies grew up to be slightly confused adults, never quite sure if they'd actually experienced their own birthdays or only dreamed them. Family albums were filled with photos of babies, toddlers, and small children, all sound asleep. In some towns the only way to tell a child from a loaf of bread was to poke them gently and see which one snored. Eventually, medical wisdom shifted, and the miracle babies became just babies again, louder, more demanding, and, in the eyes of their weary parents, perhaps a bit less miraculous. But for one surreal chapter, Spain's newborns were the calms on earth, sung to sleep by slow motion, land, if anyone had written it down at all, as the quietest generation Spain ever knew, because sometimes a miracle is just a matter of being too mellow to make a fuss. Every town had at least one, a sharp-dressed gentleman with a briefcase of little glass vials promising solutions to your every ailment. Feeling sad? Try this. Aching knees? Maybe this one existential dread double dose on the house. Some salesmen were so convincing they almost believed their own pitch until they dozed off mid-veil. The traveling salesman was both legend and necessity in Morphine era Spain. Dressed to impress, hat, gleaming shoes, polished, mustache, perfectly waxed, he appeared as if conjured from thin air. Just when your neighbor's nerves were fraying or your back felt one twinge away from surrender, his briefcase was his castle. Inside, nestled in velvet or straw, were a dozen or more bottles, each more mysterious than the last. Some glinted amber, some shimmered blue, and all came with a promise that life could be made just a little softer, quieter, and less annoying. He arrived with a practiced flourish and a smile wide enough to distract from his suspiciously sleepy eyes. Townsfolk would gather at the plaza, drawn by rumors and the hope of a free sample. "This," he'd announce, holding up a tiny corked bottle, "is my patented elixir of serenity, endorsed by 3 out of 4 local priests, 2 grandmothers, and at least 1 satisfied goat." The crowd laughed. He leaned in and dropped his voice. Perfect for Mondays, market days, and mothers-in-law. His pitch was a performance. He'd listen with infinite patience to the woes of old men. "I haven't slept since the harvest of '98. Harried mothers, I'd trade my youngest for a quiet hour. And anxious teens, will this help with exams or romance?" With a knowing nod he selected the ideal potion, always with a personal touch. "For you, Senora, something floral for you, join, and the strong stuff." No one ever really knew what was in the bottles, but the ritual was half the cure. The best salesman could diagnose a soul's unrest from 20 paces and prescribe relief before you even finished your complaint. They were part healer, part magician, part therapist, and all showman. Some even carried handwritten testimonials from distant, possibly imaginary, customers. Señorita Ramona writes from Córdoba, "I have not argued with my husband in 3 weeks." Conan Selma from Valencia reports, "My knees no longer predict the weather, but I sleep like a saint." Of course, the suitcase also held surprises for the salesman himself. The road was hard, and a little sample now and then was just part of the job. Some perhaps sampled more often than strictly necessary. There were stories of salesmen who sold the same bottle twice or who offered special discounts during a particularly dreamy afternoon. Once a salesman was caught napping on a customer's porch, his suitcase open, the contents rearranged by curious children and one very ambitious cat. The town's regular doctor often regarded the salesman with a mixture of envy and suspicion. Was he competition, a necessary evil, or just another lost soul hawking sleep in a bottle? Sometimes the doctor would buy a vial or 2 himself, just for research. After all, who could resist a product with a label like "guaranteed to unravel knots," emotional and otherwise? Inevitably some salesman overpromised and underdelivered. A cure for sadness turned out to be a recipe for a very early bedtime. A remedy for indigestion made one unfortunate farmer forget where he'd parked his donkey. Yet the townsfolk forgave these minor mishaps. The hope in the bottle was worth almost as much as its contents. As laws changed and regulations tightened, the days of the traveling salesman faded. Their briefcases grew dusty, and the plazas grew quieter. But their legend lingered, the sharp-dressed, stranger, suitcase in hand who could silence aches and soothe troubles, if only for a little while. Because sometimes what people needed most wasn't just medicine. It was the promise that someone somewhere had the perfect cure for whatever ailed you, even if he might need a nap himself before he found it. Aristocrats weren't about to be left out of the fun. Grand dinners in Madrid's finest salons featured 12 courses and 7 types of medicinal digestives. Toasts became less coherent as the night wore on, until everyone agreed that Spain's real golden age was whenever dessert is injected. In the early 1900s, Spain's elite were experts at turning even the smallest excuse into a banquet. Birthdays, name days, or the mere arrival of Friday would spark a flurry of invitations on creamy paper sent by footmen or fast-trotting nephew. Ladies and gentlemen gathered beneath gilded ceilings, dressed to the nines and ready to outline out toast and, above all, outre axe each other. Every banquet began with a flurry of appetizers and low murmurs about politics, the weather, and the shocking state of the French. But as soon as the first tonic approbative was served, usually a pinkish cordial promising to aid digestion and poetic thought, the mood shifted. Shoulders dropped, laughter got easier. Even the stiffest count loosened his cravat by the fish course. The talk had turned to family secrets and plans for impossible summer holidays by the roast. Someone was always halfway through an impromptu poem about the soulfulness of asparagus. The real event, however, was the drinks. No one drank for thirst alone. Each glass came with a backstory. This blend is based on a formula from my grandfather's pharmacist who swore it cured melancholy, insomnia, and disappointment in nephews. Guests compared remedies the way modern collectors might compare rare wines. Some bragged of special shipments from Paris or Vienna, bottles with hand-painted labels, wax seals and enough morphine to hush a room full of toddlers. Digestives arrived in waves, first a syrup for clarity, then a crystal decanter of serenity essence, next a dainty glass of elixir of afterthought poured just as conversation began to meander. At some tables hosts hired their own remedy. Somber, who recommended pairings for both the main course and any emotional upsets that might surface mid-meal, feeling regretful about a lost love, try the nocturnal cure doubts about your inheritance. The blue velvet tonic never fails. Of course, things sometimes went sideways. Toast started out lofty to our ancestors, our children and the beauty of the Iberian sunset, but grew sloppier as the night wore on by the dessert course. Someone was inevitably found hugging a statue or singing softly to the floral centerpiece. The line between banquet and collective nap blurred. There are stories of entire dining rooms dozing off before the fruit and cheese plate, only to wake in confusion and start the toasts again. Waiters skilled in the art of banquet navigation developed a sixth sense for when to whisk away empty glasses and when to gently guide a snoozing marquis back to consciousness. In the kitchens, chefs competed to invent the most soothing dessert, lavender pudding, rosewater creams and for the especially daring opiate sure, served with a stern warning and a spoon shaped like a pillow. As news of the morphine epidemic began to spread, society hostesses grew more discreet. Tonic bottles were relabeled as herbal blends. Invitations hinted at an evening of rare tranquility, but behind closed doors the rituals continued, the laughter still floated through chandeliered halls and the dreams, half remembered, half invented, became the stuff of legend. In time, the banquets faded, regulations tightened, and high society found new vices. But for one golden syrupy era, Spain's finest dined, toasted and floated through history, proving that when it comes to luxury, even peace can be served by the glass. Because nothing says aristocracy quite like dessert drinks and a well-timed group nap. Spain's artistic elite embraced the morphine epidemic with gusto. Writers drafted epic novels in 3-hour bursts of inspiration, then spent 6 days napping. Painters claimed to find new colors in the lamplight, only to wake up halfway through a masterpiece brush still in hand, surrounded by empty vials and questionable artistic decisions. In those days, the creative districts of Madrid and Barcelona were thick with both genius and sleepiness. Literary salons echoed with grand ideas. If only for a few minutes at a time, I will write the great Spanish novel, someone would declare, quill poised and eyes wild. Moments later, the only sound was gentle snoring and the soft drip of ink pooling onto a manuscript. Afternoon gatherings became exercises in endurance. Would you finish your sonnet before you finished your cordial? Was that a new painting or did someone just spill syrup on the canvas? Artists wore their drowsiness as a badge of honor. To be slightly off-kilter, a little dreamy was a sign of true inspiration. The muse visits only the well-rested, claimed one poet who had not been seen fully awake since the last king abdicated. Painters arrived at studios with bags under their eyes and creative tonics tucked discreetly into their smoke. One famed modernist insisted his best work came somewhere between the second and third dose, never before breakfast. The results were at times magical. A sudden burst of energy would yield a new literary movement, a fresh school of painting, a melody that felt like the edge of a dream, and then, as if on cue, everyone would vanish for their afternoon siesta. An unspoken agreement among artists, critics, and even the gallery cats. It was an era of unfinished projects and infinite beginnings. The great Spanish novel grew longer and stranger with every chapter, as authors forgot what had happened before and simply invented new plot lines to amuse themselves. Manuscripts contained entire chapters dedicated to naps, interspersed with philosophical digressions about the nature of sleep and the best kind of pillow. Some writers even abandoned punctuation entirely, declaring it too exhausting and unnecessary for modern literature. Visual artists, meanwhile, blurred the lines between reality and every. Portraits began to resemble landscapes, landscapes grew faces and mysterious yawning animals. One painter exhibited a canvas titled Siesta with Blue Goat, later admitting he'd meant to paint a self-portrait but fell asleep halfway through. Another held an exhibition called the Dream Series, 5 empty frames and a comfortable SHA's lounge for viewers to enjoy their own interpretations. The critics, of course, were in their element. No one could accuse an artist of laziness. It was simply the style. A half-finished sculpture was praised as an exploration of incompleteness. A poem that trailed off midline was an invitation to contemplation, if you don't understand it. One reviewer wrote, "You probably just need a nap." Music was not immune. Composers penned lullabies that stretched for hours, orchestras performed at half speed and concertgoers brought cushions and blankets to recital. The great debate of the time was not about key signatures, but about the best time of day for inspiration, right before siesta or immediately after. As the morphine era faded, Spain's artists found new ways to chase the muse, some with coffee, some with wild arguments, and many with memories of the sleepiest creative period in the nation's history. The masterpieces that survived are still celebrated, the unfinished ones quietly admired for their ambition and their unintentional honesty. Because in that drowsy golden age, Spain learned that true art sometimes happens not in the grand moment of inspiration but in the gentle drift between waking and dreaming, and that occasionally the best brush stroke is the one you don't remember making. What happens in Spain doesn't always stay in Spain. As shipping routes expanded, so did the reach of Spanish remedies. Soon travelers returned home raving about the wonders of Madrid's pharmacies and smuggling home enough tonic to make even the customs officials sleepy. Europe would never nap the same way again. It began with the tourists. English aristocrats in search of the continental sun, German poets fleeing their own weather and French intellectuals in pursuit of new decadence all found their way to Spain's golden plazas and eventually its quietly miraculous apothecaries. After a few days in Madrid, visitors would wax lyrical about the architecture, the art and the mysterious little brown bottles sold by the local pharmacist. Marvelous stuff, they'd say, tucking a few vials into their valise before boarding the next train. Just the thing for nerves, travel fatigue and overexposure to opera. Soon word spread through the cosmopolitan circles of Europe, Spanish remedies became the must-have souvenir, ranking just above lace fans and slightly below sherry let us home red. Like advertisements. I have found the answer to mother's chatter and father's gout. The Spaniards call it tranquilize, and I have never slept so well in my life. Some tourists became accidental ambassadors, distributing samples among friends, family and the occasional customs agent who, after a sip, forgot to check the rest of the luggage. Enterprising Spanish pharmacists caught on fast. Those with international contacts began packaging their tonics with multilingual labels for anxiety. Divided by Fer Nerva, divided by Poor Lat, tranquility pamphlets were slipped into luggage extolling the benefits of elixir madrileine and cordial. Pharmacies in Barcelona and Valencia advertised in French and German newspapers, offering to ship their famous nerve syrup across the continent. No prescription required, just an address and a sturdy postman. It wasn't just tourists fueling the export craze. Spanish expat riots sent bottles to relatives in Paris, Vienna, and beyond. Students at foreign universities nursed homesickness with familiar doses. Diplomats became known for hosting the sleepiest, most civil diplomatic dinners in all of Europe. Their secret weapon, discreetly poured from cut glass decanters, labeled herbal cordial. Inevitably, copycats emerged. Pharmacists in London and Milan tried to reverse-engineer the Spanish tonic, substituting whatever was at hand. The results were mixed. Some concoctions resulted in nothing more than a mild sugar rush. Others had side effects so dramatic that an entire British cricket team once fell asleep before their match, losing by default and inventing the concept of the strategic group nap. As the Spanish tonic craze swept the continent, not everyone was delighted. Parisian physicians sniffed at the Iberian habit, warning that l'homme espagnol was just a polite way to sleep through one's problems. Vine's critics wrote treatises against syndromes imported from the peninsula. In private, however, they requested samples. The Russians, impressed by anything that promised a good night's sleep, started offering vodka chasers. In art circles, the influence was immediate. The dreamy, drowsy quality of Spanish morphine-inspired works began to appear in the salons of Berlin and St. Petersburg. Critics debated whether a new sleeping school had been born. Writers composed volleys that read like fever dreams, then excused their tangled plots with a wink and a reference to My Summer in Seville. Of course, the party couldn't last forever. Customs officials, eventually, waking up to the trend, began cracking down on imports. Foreign governments issued warnings and enterprising travelers switched to less suspicious bottles hiding morphine in olive oil tins, perfume flacons or, in one legendary case, a hollowed-out baguette. By the time Europe's were properly regulated, the Spanish tonic had left its mark, a generation of sleepy writers, mellow musicians and one very relaxed border collie in Antwerp. Because sometimes the greatest export isn't wine, olive oil or art, it's the promise of a really, perfect nap and the collective memory of the time when Spain taught all of Europe the fine art of letting go, drifting off and waking up just in time for dessert. So tonight, as you drift off in your soft regulations bed, maybe with nothing more illicit than an extra pillow, take a moment to remember Spain's morphine years. The age when just a little something for the nerves was national policy and the only thing more common than a siesta was a pharmacist who knew you by name, address and questionable medical history. Let's be honest, the Spanish morphine epidemic was part tragedy, partly human. People meant well, even when their prescriptions were a little well over-enthusiastic, from elegant grandmothers nodding off at family dinners to doctors who genuinely thought they were helping. To the poets who accidentally invented surrealism in a haze of miracle tonics, everyone was just trying to get through the day, one ampoule at a time. Maybe not so different from us, really, minus the morphine, plus 3 streaming services, a drawer full of vitamins and a mild fear of WebMD. But there's something quietly admirable about it too, people muddling through with what they had, clinging to hope and science, even if the science had a few, let's say, side effects. Spain survived its sleepiest decade and eventually woke up a little wiser, a lot more cautious about what goes in the medicine cabinet and still stubbornly devoted to the sacred art of the afternoon nap. So as you tuck yourself in tonight, surrounded by clean sheets, Tylenol instead of tonics and maybe a glass of water that definitely won't poison, you spare a grateful thought for all those who came before, for the pharmacists with their mysterious remedies, the families who stuck together or at least napped together, and for everyone who lived, laughed and sometimes slept through history, because, in the end, humanity is resilient, resourceful and a little bit ridiculous, and that's how we made it to the age of memory foam and reasonable warning labels. Sleep well, and may your dreams be only as strange as Spanish advertising in 1907.